having outlined what we have to consider if we're going to work out whether we have an enforceable contract in place, the first place to start is with the major area in the module, a simple apparent contract. Why is it called a simple apparent contract? First word, simple. Well, it deals with that issue of formalities. There were some contracts that are required to be in writing, etc. So it distinguishes them, and it says this is kind of most contracts, with those exceptions for the ones where you're legislated that you have to have it in writing, etc., or in a certain form. It's a simple contract, okay? Second, apparent. Why apparent? Well, it looks like you got a contract. There might be some reasons that we find out later that you don't have an enforceable contract, like unconscionability, undue influence, lack of capacity. So it looks like simple, apparent. Looks like you've got a contract. So what does it take to look like you've got a contract? You need agreement, intent, and consideration. And as this diagram is trying to articulate, does a diagram articulate? Anyway, what this diagram is trying to show that it's only when you have the three together that you have a legally enforceable agreement. You need the three to have a contract. You have intent to enter a deal and you've paid something for it, but if you've paid something for it but you haven't agreed to what the terms are, you don't have a contract. You have agreement and you've paid for something but you didn't intend to enter into a legally enforceable agreement, like washing your sibling's bike, no contract. Same agreement and intent without consideration, no contract. You need the three. And the first one we're going to look at is probably the one that we're going to spend the most time on. Agreement. It's the area where you can run into most problems in business, because while it might seem that you've agreed, you may not have, and we'll explain why as we go through this particular content. So what is an agreement? An agreement is a meeting of minds that occurs when two or more people share understanding and intent. Now, really, this is a little bit more difficult. I like using the frame meeting of minds because I think it helps people understand that you need kind of both parties to know the basis of what they're agreeing to. We need that meeting of minds. The only thing is that people often lie or misremember when there's money at stake. The people have been known to lie in court. So we don't actually ask them if there's a meeting of minds. Like, we don't ask person A and person B, what did you agree? Was there a meeting of minds around this contract? What we do instead is we say, what would an independent observer think? What would a reasonable person think? Would a reasonable person think that there's been a meeting of minds, that they've agreed? So in order to do that, rather than reading anyone's minds, what we look for is a valid offer and a valid acceptance. So we can say agreement is going to be visible. We're going to be able to say that we've got this meeting of minds if we can identify an offer to buy or sell something or supply something or do something, and an acceptance of that offer. Offer plus acceptance equals agreement. Once we have agreement, then we have the contract and obligations begin. So it's a really critical point. We can have all of this talking going on, people talking. When the agreement happens, that's when the contract occurs. That's a critical point in time, and we need to understand where the contract is formed, where it crystallizes. Because at this point, what were negotiations, expressions of interest, potentially promises, these turned into legally binding promises. That's why that point of crystallization is so critical to understand. An example might help to strengthen the claim that understanding this point of where agreement occurs is so important. Now, many times it isn't. It's going to be very clear where it occurs. Everyone's going to know, yes, my rights start here and yours start there and what we're entitled to. But take the situation that we have here, that you go to a bike shop and they agree to sell a bike to you, but you want to go away for the day and do something else and come and pick up the bike tomorrow. So, has the contract occurred where they've agreed to sell it to you, or does it occur when you pick it up? Understanding where the contract forms is important, particularly if something happens to the bike between those 2 points. So normally, if the shop has agreed to sell you the bike, even though they're holding it for you, they can't sell it anymore. So it's really your bike. Why does that matter? Imagine the bike gets damaged. If they haven't agreed to sell it to you, if it's not your bike, then it's their problem that the bike got damaged. However, if they have agreed to sell it to you and there's a contract, even though you've gone away and they're holding it, if the bike gets damaged, that's your problem because it's your bike. So the point of where agreement occurs involves a fundamental transference of risk from a business perspective. Most of the time, it's probably not going to matter, but sometimes it can really matter a lot. And as I've said before, from a second perspective, you really want to make sure that you do have an agreement, not you think you have an agreement, but you really don't. But to take that further, we've got to start thinking about what we mean by this idea of an offer. Agreements begin with an offer. What's an offer? Well, that's where someone expresses a willingness to immediately enter into a contract on stated terms with the person to whom the offer is directed. So this person has to direct an offer to someone else. That's the first thing to note. This is our offeror, and this is what we call the offeree. By the way, we'll come back to the fact that you can offer to more than one person, but we'll get into that later. Let's just pretend for the moment it's single person to person. That offer could be written, right? You could send an email to someone saying, I offer to buy your computer for $600. That would be, if that was written down, could be in a letter, could be in an email, could be in a DM. Okay, if that's written down, that'll be an offer. It could be verbal. You could just offer to buy, right? So you could write an email. It could be a verbal offer. It could be implied by conduct. That's a really interesting one. So these are express offers because you express them, and then this one is implied. How would you imply something by conduct? So generally this is going to occur where we're involving some activity that's repetitious. It could be repetitious between the two parties, and we might talk about in the lecture or shoot. But another example might be, I don't know, just say you're overseas and you're going to a museum and you want to buy a ticket. So you go up to the ticket booth and there's a person behind it, and you just can't speak any of the language where you are, and you put up 2 fingers, not to be rude to them. You're saying, I would like 2 tickets by gesturing with 2 fingers. Now, the person behind the counter may say nothing. They might push through the 2 tickets for you, and you put the money through, and no words are spoken at all. It is all implied by conduct. You offer to buy the 2 tickets by holding your 2 fingers up at the ticket counter, so they know that you want 2. So they accept, they push it across, and you exchange the money and you get your tickets. That's an example of the offer where you put your 2 fingers up, is an offer to buy the tickets by conduct. So offers can be written down, they can be spoken, and they can be implied by conduct. So why don't we go back to that example that we started with? In particular, in our espresso machine drama, let's have a look at what's going on. So we've got the cafe, we've got the owner of the cafe scrolling through Instagram when they see a post. That looks like an offer, a new espresso machine. That's the machine Jordan's been dreaming about without hesitating. DMs, I'll take one if you can deliver by Friday. Looks like an acceptance. Offer, espresso machine, acceptance. Or is it? So as well as knowing how we deliver an offer, we've got to know what is not an offer. There are some things that look like offers but are not offers. They are called invitations to treat. And another thing that can look like an offer is a response to a request for information. So these are things that you've got to be aware of that you might think are an offer, but they're not. Because if someone accepts one of these things, they're not really accepting an offer and there's no agreement yet. So invitations to treat, let's deal with them first. And we have two very famous cases here. The first case I actually really like because it's a case about the law being used as part of a defense of a business strategy disruption. Oh my God, what are you talking about? Okay, well, in the olden days, when there were pharmacies like we have, well, not like we have here, Boots was the revolutionary new approach to it. What you would have was all the drugs would be on shelves behind a counter, and the pharmacist would be behind the counter, and you would go in and say what I'd like, and the pharmacist would go up to the shelves, get what you wanted, and they'd then take it to the cash register, right? And you would give them your money, and they would give you the drugs, and away you would go. Even if you wanted some Panadol, it was on these shelves, right, behind this person. Boots Cash Chemists came up with a very, very different way of business. So this diagram is you looking at it. Now imagine we go to bird's eye view, right? You're looking down from on top. This is what Boots Cash Chemists did. They had the shop. They put all the drugs on the shelves on the outside. And then in the middle, they put a big square desk, right? And they put the pharmacist in the middle. And so what would happen is all the people would come in, and you would go to the shelf and you would pick out what you wanted and you would take it over to the pharmacist who would ring it up and sell it. So you can see the difference in business model that's going on with Pharmaceutical Society and Boots. So this is Boots. They've got this new business model, Boots Cash Chemist. Why is it so disruptive? It's like the change that happened in McDonald's or in Coles or whatever, where you have to do the ordering at McDonald's rather than someone taking your order. Or you have to ring up all your stuff at Coles or Woolworths these days rather than having too many people at the checkout helping you put it all through, which was the only way you used to be able to do it. Why? It does away with the amount of labour that's needed. It's a much cheaper way to operate. So Boots are winning the business battle because they can operate with fewer pharmacists and have a much cheaper cost structure. Of course, the traditional pharmacists who were represented by the pharmaceutical societies do not like this. So they want to stop this business model. And how do they do it? Well, they go to the law. And there was actually a piece of law, I think it was called the Poisons Act. And the Poisons Act said that if you sell any drugs, it must be sold under the supervision of a pharmacist. So the key problem is, where does the sale occur, right? Very clearly here the pharmacist goes and gets it and gives it to you and rings it up and they're there. So it's very clearly supervised it. In the traditional approach, in the new approach, if the goods on display, if the Panadol here are an offer, then you accept it and the sale occurs here. And if the sale occurs at the shelf, there's no pharmacist involved. And you've breached the Poisons Act, and this would be an illegal way to operate. However, if the sale occurs when the customer offers to buy it, which is what Boots are going to argue in court, the customer offers to buy it and the pharmacist accepts at the till, then it will be all okay in the business model because the sale occurs under the supervision. So the critical issue is, are goods on display, things on shelves, in the shop window, things like that, are they an offer or are they something else? And the court held they're something else. They are invitations to treat. Now, there's lots of reasons for it. For instance, if it was an offer and you took it off, you wouldn't be able to put it back. Or if you took a drink off and dropped it and it broke and it's smashed, you'd have to pay for it because it's yours, not theirs, etc. So there are many reasons why the courts found that way. But they're actually saying goods on display are an invitation to treat, which is another way of saying that can be an offer for you to make offers. You got to take it and make an offer around it. So in this case, Boots Cash Chemist won. The court held goods on display are an invitation to treat. And that becomes our legal principle out of this case. Goods on display, an invitation to treat, not an offer. Similarly, ads, advertisements are invitations to treat, not offers. Why? Because if every ad was an offer, and 100,000 people decided to accept the offer in an ad, the company couldn't supply. It would gum up marketing, like the policy implications would be huge. So ads in general are an invitation to treat, not an offer. This case was actually a very famous example of an exception to that, which I don't want us to worry about. I just realize it's there. It's not always the case, but virtually all the time, advertisements are going to be invitations to treat, not offers. That means you can't accept it and have an agreement. If you want what is advertised, you go in and offer to buy what was advertised. The shop has to accept. Okay, so just to reiterate, we've got to distinguish an offer from an invitation to treat. An invitation to treat is an offer by the shop to consider your offer to buy it. The practical reality is you can't accept an invitation to treat. You go and offer to buy it. Invitations to treat includes things like ads, catalogs, price lists, goods on display in shop windows, on shelves. These are all examples of invitations to treat. But having said that, right, sometimes things that look like goods on display, for example, a vending machine, are not. If it's automated, the thing on display is actually an offer, not an invitation to treat. Why? Well, because there's nothing else that supplier can do. Like, how did they accept your offer? Like, they're offering when the packet of chips is in the machine and you accept when you put your money in. Same thing for going car parking, etc. Any automated transaction, which is really going to make it interesting with the rise of AI. And it may cause us to fundamentally rethink some things about agreement. But generally in business, we need to distinguish invitations to treat from offers. That's a major way something that looks like an offer might not be an offer. In the next video, we're going to go on to another way that might occur, right, through a response to a request for information in the next video.